we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you guys again for joining. This is the webinar on innovative models to relocalize food systems, brought to you by Business Alliance for Local Living Economies. Most of you guys know us as BALLE. My name is Jill Epner, and I'm the Director of Community Engagement at BALLE. We have about 130 localist leaders that have registered for today's call, and I think we had a wait list of close to 75 folks as well. So this was obviously a really popular topic, and I'm glad to have everyone here and glad you guys were able to grab a spot to this webinar at all. So we've got a lot of folks on the phone today, and since many of you guys are probably new to BALLE, I wanted to take just a moment to tell you a little bit about our organization. BALLE is the fastest growing business alliance of values-aligned entrepreneurs, business networks, and local economy funders in North America. We're leveraging the collective voice of this movement to drive new investment, spread the best solutions, and harness the power of local independently owned business to transform the communities where we work and live. BALLE believes that certain principles matter to achieve sustainable, resilient, and happy communities. We believe that ownership matters, place matters, opportunity matters, nature matters, and that we must measure what matters, and relationships matter most. These are something we call our 6 tenets. Don't forget to like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter at Be a Localist, where we're live tweeting this webinar. So now I'm going to dive right into introducing the topic and speakers for today. This is going to be an interactive discussion that's going to highlight ways to build regionalized local food systems, especially those in a way that keep capital costs low and increase viability in the long run. This webinar is really geared towards leaders and food system innovators, food makers, growers, processors, incubators, retail outlets, and those who are focused particularly on aggregation and distribution. And you guys will also be the first to gain access to Local Orbit's interactive toolkit, which literally went live this morning, guys, filled with resources and information to support all of those building the new food economy. We've got a really exciting lineup for you. So now, a little bit more about our speakers. Erica Block is the CEO of Local Orbit, which supports diverse local distribution models across the country. Prior to Local Orbit, Erica founded an entrepreneurial arts organization producing cross-sector partnerships in the U.S., Great Britain, and South Africa. Throughout her career, Erica has created collaborative environments that facilitate learning and action. She is a PopTech Social Innovation Fellow and comes from a family of fruit peddlers, meat processors, restaurant owners, and wholesalers. Also joining us is Noah Fulmer, who is the founder and executive director of Farm Fresh Rhode Island before joining Local Orbit as director of training and capacity building. Farm Fresh Rhode Island runs farmers markets, a processing kitchen, and a wholesale food hub connecting 60 local producers to over 100 chefs, grocers, schools, and institutions every week. So 2 quick notes. My BALLE colleague Carl Johnson is going to be live tweeting this webinar. So as I put a note in the chat handle, feel free to enter your Twitter handle into the chat window, and we'll give you guys a shout out. And just a note, too, since we have so many people on this webinar and everyone's lines are muted, the chat window is going to be one of the most important parts of the webinar, particularly for the Q&A session, which is going to happen at the end. We have 15 or 20 minutes slated for Q&A. So this is the chat window is where you can pose questions to the speakers or even to each other. So please use that frequently if something comes up. I'm going to be moderating the questions during the Q&A period, and I'm going to take a lot of the questions that come up from the chat window and serve them up to Erica and Noah. So Erica and Noah, we want to give you guys a big thank you for presenting today. And with that, I'm going to pass it along to you guys.
Thanks. Thank you. So hi everyone, this is Erica. I'm going to give you a little bit of an overview of what we see happening in the market and some of the opportunities that will come from the way we're seeing relocalization processes beginning. And then we're going to, Noah's going to talk a little bit about some of the obstacles that we see, and then we'll talk through some examples and some tools and a way to think about launching local food systems businesses that will apply. We're applying it specifically to distribution, but in fact it applies to any good business creation. So with that, I'm going to start just talking a little bit about the reality is that I think most of us on this call know that we've spent the last 60 or 70 years building a hyper-efficient, globalized food system that feeds a lot of people, and it creates a lot of problems.
And Eric, I'm just going to interrupt real quick. We're getting a couple folks from the chat window saying to speak up just a little. So if you could just make sure you're real close to the phone.
All right, we will do that. Is that any better, you guys? Can I hear that?
Yeah, I think that is better. Thank you.
Great. Sorry about that. So just basically, we've spent the last 70 years building this centralized, hyper-efficient food system that feeds a lot of people and creates a lot of problems. Pesticide runoff, obesity, disappearing family farms. And there's growing recognition that food we get from farms and other producers that we know and trust who live closer to us not only tastes better, but it's safer and more nutritious, and it's better for local economies. And, you know, we all want to buy from farms and producers we know and trust, and we also want our restaurants and institutions to do the same. But the reality is, a chef has to work really hard to do that. And even though there's a lot of complexity to this, we've seen 18 to 20% year-over-year growth over more than a decade of local food sales compared to conventional food sales. So looking at the numbers, there's about $9 billion a year in food that gets sold in localized supply chains through farmers, farm stands, community-supported agriculture, food hubs, any of the sort of more direct market channels. So that sounds like a really big number, $9 billion. But in context, we spend $1.75 trillion a year on food. So that $9 billion is 0.00004% or thereabout. So, and one of the problems is, in spite of the demand, we still have systems where in order to buy local, most people have to talk to many producers. So a chef will pick up the phone and call 20 farmers. The farmers are talking to 10 or 15 chefs, and it's very inefficient. So the information is fragmented, and the distribution processes are still inefficient because of all of the centralization that was created over the last century, the last half of the last century. But despite these inefficiencies, as I said before, local food sales have grown 18 to 20% annually in the past decade, which really indicates the market demand and the fact that people are working hard to do this. And I like to talk about the shifting landscape. There's this magic 20% number that people point to. You know, basically there are 481 hospitals that have signed the Healthy Food and Healthcare Pledge, which includes a commitment to source 20% local. You see state governments saying they want to commit to 20% of procurement coming from local sources. You see universities and other corporate dining services taking similar pledges to increase the amount of food that's sourced locally. So what's really interesting is because of the demand, because of these mandates, because everybody knows it's better for their local economies and it's better quality food, we have an opportunity, if we can change the ratio of from $9 billion to $350 billion in today's dollars. That's what 20% represents. So what's happened? So what I like to ask is, what problems can we solve if we change that ratio? How can we improve local economies, restore family farms, create sustainable, healthy businesses? And a lot of people are seeing this. There's new aggregation and distribution models that are emerging across the country, across North America, to meet the growing demand for local food. We call them the connectors and aggregators. There are groups of producers that are forming cooperatives to share marketing and distribution. There's food hubs. There's independent local distributors, the girl with a truck who picks up from farms and delivers to restaurants. And then there's farmers markets that are starting to look at leveraging their physical hub space in terms of as wholesale distribution points. So the core element, the commonality to all these models is that they really are promoting the story of the farmer and enabling transparency in the supply chain and allowing sort of maximum value to the producer. So one of the things that we like to talk about is the supply chains as stories. And the problem has been in the past is things have gotten further away from us. The story has been lost. The global supply chains are much more opaque. You don't know where your food comes from. You don't know about the person who produced it. But essentially, supply chains are really about making sure the right person gets the right information at the right time, so the right thing happens. So beyond the story of the farm, there's also the story of what needs to happen when. And that's what we see as sort of one of the critical problems that people face, is the storytelling tools, the business tools that have enabled them to scale these businesses, to grow these local food economies, haven't been available to them. And that's essentially what Local Orbit is creating, is tools that allow people to tell the right story to the right person at the right time. And we work in 12 states, and we've seen farmer sales grow. From 2012 to 2013, they grew 300% annually across the platform. So sometimes just giving people the opportunity to have the right tools can really have an impact on these businesses. One of the things that we're looking at, apart from working with folks in terms of technology, is we end up working on the ground with people who are coming up with new business models and trying to figure out how to grow sustainable businesses. And so we're starting to see a lot of trends. We're seeing multi-farm, community-supported agriculture organizations, groups that have brought together farms for CSAs, starting, for example, to turn more to wholesale sales as CSAs have plateaued. We're seeing a growth of incubator kitchens for food makers that are now starting to look at collaborative distribution. And we're seeing people who are just bootstrapping, who are able to sort of connect buyers and sellers in very simple ways, start small, and then really quickly grow over time. And so we're going to talk a little bit about those models. But before we do, I want to kind of turn it over to Noah to talk about some of the challenges that we also see.
Yeah, thank you. So, in this food system, it's a pretty complex way that food gets from producers to consumers. And I think there's a challenge that happens in a lot of communities that are looking to rebuild a food system that's fair, that's more transparent, that's healthier, around just the complexity of the problem that's out there. It's so dysfunctional in so many ways, and there are so many moving parts. And, how do you fix the food system in a way that does get that healthy, fresh, wonderful food from farmers to the table, to all of the tables? And so there's, I think, an inclination in some places to start really, really big with the theory and with trying to make the perfect food system for an area, and why shouldn't you want to have that, except that it makes it a very challenging thing to make happen on the ground, because we're literally talking about something very tangible, food, something that we all interact with multiple times a day, that's moving from place to place. It's a physical good. And so the challenge is when you start with this big picture planning, oftentimes the problems just keep on getting more complex and more systems oriented, and you could be spending a lot of time talking about what's the feasibility of a grand plan to reshape things, and how many years do you need to spend planning and surveying and assessing and doing all the theory work around the food system, when every day there are people eating, and there's an opportunity within these everyday food is already moving places, people are growing things, people are eating things. There's an opportunity to start small with something and test it in a community, because every community, as I said, it's different, and the assets in the community are different. The type of farming, agriculture that happens in that community are different, and the types of customers are different. And so, since there is no one-size-fits-all franchise model for rebuilding a food system, you really have to start with the assets on the ground, with the people who are there, figure out who the customers are, who would be buying this food. If you're looking, to sell to restaurants or to schools or to grocers, who in the community is actually there and going to be buying the food. And then in terms of getting it from the farmers in your community, from the other producers in the community, you need someone to operate that. You need someone to go beyond just the theoretical framework of it. It's entrepreneurs on the ground, whether that's a cooperative of farmers, whether it's a for-profit business, a non-profit endeavor. But it's still, you need someone who at the core wants to, get up every morning and start moving food. And it's easy to do in a small way, and just to start out with a couple of customers and with a couple of farmers. If you have a farmers market in your community, there are already people aggregating food to one central location, and that's an opportunity to bring it out to many other wholesale customers without having the farmers bring it to a new warehouse or make deliveries on their own. They're already coming to one place.
And I think what we see is that there are people who are just getting out and solving problems, and they're overall in aggregate, they're solving a very big problem, but on a day-to-day basis, they're coming up with solutions in a very incrementalist way to smaller problems, and by solving the smaller problems, they're able to ultimately build stronger businesses. And so the discussion that we want to have today and that we want you to ask questions about is, how do we start, and how do we work with entrepreneurs, and how do entrepreneurs start to address a really big problem without getting overwhelmed, without getting stuck? And so the work we've been doing, and I'll let Noah talk a little bit about our training and our hub camps, the work we've been doing is really creating a framework, taking tools that have worked in other new business creation processes to help people design small, lean solutions that can grow and adapt over time. And so,
yeah, I mean, how do you make sure that the energy that's going in is around designing an iterative operation on the ground, as opposed to, you could put a lot of money into infrastructure like a fancy new cooler or a truck that you might not need, depending on what other resources are already out there, what partners are out there. And so taking a step back from the theory and the big planning, what we thought was important and a missing resource out there for people designing these local food distribution businesses was just best practices and a forum to discuss how to design operations to move food from multiple farms, multiple producers, to a variety of wholesale customers. And so that's where we've started putting together resources like the local food distribution toolkit that's on our website at localorbit.com, and that's a pretty exciting thing that today we get to launch and share with everyone. We've been spending a couple months kicking around how to make the various resources fit together in a way that's as useful as possible to all the different businesses we currently work with, and hopefully to everyone out there who's thinking about starting a new food distribution business, because we need more of you. And we also have in-person opportunities, such as the hub camps that we've been running across the country. The idea is to have a 3-day intensive boot camp style workshop where people really get into the zone, talking about the nuts and bolts, breaking apart all the different pieces of running a local food distribution business and what it means.
And I mean, at the core, what we're looking at is taking tools such as the business model canvas, which is something that is a fairly common tool that you can learn more about afterwards. We'll give you links to this information. But essentially, coming up with a framework to help people start and move quickly rather than to be paralyzed by the grandness of the problems, and to sort of say, this is what I can do today, even though I have a sense of the big picture. These are the tools at my disposal to help me jump in. And our toolkit is about that. The way that we've started working with entrepreneurs, because we see a lot of them, is really about how do you start. And you still need a plan, but how do you do more than have a 25-page business plan that ultimately sits on the shelf? And how do you learn? Because once you start something, it never will look like what you thought it was going to look like before you're actually in it. And so I'm going to kind of move through the business model canvas. We're not going to talk about this today. We'll give you access to this and access to the tools. But I think what we really want to do is start. I see a question, actually. Somebody's talking about software startup language. And actually, it sounds like software startup language. I'm going to jump in and answer this on the spot. This is Chris asking. I actually don't think that this is about software. Software is important to running businesses, but designing businesses and designing processes is really critical to designing supply chains. And really, the reason Big Food is what it is because it's a very meticulously designed set of supply chains that are thoughtful, and they've created solutions to problems of moving food. So while it sounds like a software language, it's actually really kind of embedded in supply chains. And
I think what's interesting, a lot of us in this work, we're very mission-driven. We're very motivated and passionate about local economies and about local food. And I think in some ways it's helpful to break out of the mold of what we think about in these mission-driven contexts and use tools from other sectors that enable us to think very intentionally about the different pieces of what we're doing with a little bit less of the passion and emotion maybe attached to it. So it's just, it's providing through these tools that are very popular in the startup world, a different lens to look on the same problems.
Yeah. And in fact, it is about designing logistics, and it's about designing distribution entities and redesigning the norm that's been designed for us. And then so it's an interesting. Language is complicated. I have to say that even a term like food hub is a complicated term. There's no really good language around this because it's a relatively emerging sort of new market. But fundamentally, I think both Noah and I. And I think this is actually a good opportunity to sort of bring in some of Noah's experience at Farm Fresh Rhode Island. We believe that the mission is important, but the mission alone is not going to solve the problems. There's too much opportunity, there's too much complexity, and so it is being really conscious about not only designing but training the people and giving people access to the resources and giving people what they need to sort of think through businesses. And it's not specific to software, it's not specific to any sector. It's really, what we're trying to do is find a way to take tools that work in different ways, adapt them to the needs of this particular market, but also in such a way that is really flexible for people to do what's right for their own communities and their own businesses.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it is also, providing resources that have otherwise not been necessarily available to this people targeting this niche of business. I know when we were starting Farm Fresh in Rhode Island, we had this grand vision of a food system in which every dinner plate was filled with fresh, healthy food coming from our growing region. And yet we didn't start with that vision when we were actually pushing programs. That we started with a single farmers market in the downtown of Providence and grew from there to a network of neighborhood markets over the years, grew to doing a year-round market in a place that has a fairly limited growing season, or had at the time, and now you wind up with lots of year-round production on farms, and of course you have seafood and meat and other things that were year-round that now had a marketplace for them through the farmers market. And then with all these farmers markets, we realized there was that huge other piece of the food puzzle, all the other ways that people get food besides directly from their farmer, the 99% or more of how people source their food. And so we needed to figure out ways to get into grocery stores and into schools and into restaurants, and we're able to leverage the network of farmers that we had already been working with through these farmers markets, and able to leverage a network of chefs who had been shopping at the markets and going one by one to the farmers' tables and said, why don't we figure out a better system, and why don't we start with some of the people who've already, helped to make this network at Farm Fresh successful in the first place. And so we were an example where out of a farmer's market, out of the back corner room, we were able to get things going onto trucks to do deliveries, but very small scale, where there were some pre-orders coming into farmers already coming to that farmer's market. They didn't have to make any other arrangements to get the food to us, and it was then all easy for us to collect it at the farmer's market and get it out while the farmer's market was happening, before figuring out whether to buy a new space and new coolers and just do everything same day. And as it grew, and it grew in its first year to about $200,000 in sales, and then the next year it was at $600,000, and then it was $1 million and 1.5 and 2. And as we grew to this place where now it's $2 million a year of local food transacting from those 60 farms to about 100 customers from Boston down to southwestern Rhode Island, and it's a nice region about an hour radius around Providence, and it breaks even, which is the goal of Farm Fresh as a nonprofit. But we didn't break even at first, and we didn't necessarily, though we didn't have the capital to go crazy with all these fancy shiny pieces of equipment that I hear some folks talking about, and I get worried because food distribution doesn't have huge margins, and especially if you want the farmers to be able to get a fair price. And if you don't want to wind up with really expensive product on the customer end, which is makes it hard to get new customers when that's the situation, you need to really build the business in a way that matches the demand and the supply. But really, you need to be iterative and experimental as you go along.
And you need to also take a look at what resources exist. And I think what Farm Fresh did is it looked at the farmers markets and the relationships that it had. We work with a farmer who's created his own food hub. He doesn't call it that, but what he does is he recognizes that he he goes to farmers markets. He also has capacity on his farms through what he grows, and he has a bakehouse on the farm. And what he does is he takes orders from buyers for products from many different farms, and when he sees them at the farmers markets, he picks up the stuff from them and then aggregates them. This is a consumer market, actually, for pickups and through buying clubs. So what he's doing, he's saying, look, I have products to sell. I'm growing stuff. I've got a kitchen and an oven, and I'm baking stuff. And I also know that the people I want to sell to want more diversity. And the farmers and the other food producers that I see every week at the farmers market, they need more markets. So he's really looking at what is his supply chain like, and how can he take the relationships he has and talk to the people that he's already doing business with and expand and grow. And we've seen him, continue to grow from one pickup site to 4 pickup sites in the summer, and the customers love it because they can get what they need for the week through the range of producers that he's brought into the network. Is there something you were going to say?
Oh yeah, I think what's neat about this is we've been able to go to different parts of the country through the hub camps and really start to create regional networks among startup hubs that are there to have support from each other and work through some of the challenges and issues of starting up a hub. And we've done one in Michigan and one around LA, and there's one coming up actually at the end of this week in Davis, California. And it's about 20 folks who get together from a region, and actually some people are coming to the Davis one from the Hudson Valley in Mississippi, and it's nice to get the different perspectives of people talking through the issues of how to network a group of farmers into this supply chain so that they have access to different types of customers in their community than they had before.
It's interesting. I'm looking at the question that Molly just put out there, and I was going to tell you another story. And we also work with a couple of urban farming co-ops, and now those are folks that are basically, Molly's question is really asking about urban and on-site agriculture. So these stories, these businesses that are cropping up, they're really diverse. So we work with folks that are using vacant lots and maybe a dozen farms and aggregating product to sell to restaurants, and they're also doing joint market stands. I think that what's really interesting, and this kind of relates to the quote of involvement. I see that it seems there's some romanticism involved with helping the existing farmers. Quite frankly, this isn't really about helping the farmers. It's mostly what we see as the most effective aggregation models tend to be farmer driven, and I won't say that that's universal, but my experience has been is when there is a group of farmers or a single farmer at the center of these aggregation networks, and I call them aggregation networks, food hubs, whatever you want to use, what language, it tends to come from farmers who are really good business people. Not all farmers bring the same sort of business thinking into what they do, but those who are surviving and those who are growing are figuring out ways to reduce the steps from their product to the table, but also understand that things like farmers markets are actually really unsustainable for them. They're not great revenue drivers except for in a handful of locations. So it's the farmers who are really driving, I think, some of the most interesting models in this space.
And I would say especially, this type of distribution platform is a huge asset to a lot of new farmers and who are starting businesses in areas that have saturation, in terms of the vendors at a farmer's market. And so there is the opportunity to, again, widen the number of venues and opportunities that are out there in the marketplace for these farmers who are coming on board and maybe can't get in to the most popular farmers market in town, but they can now have access to chefs and to other types of customers that without this type of aggregation work, it becomes very tricky, and they would not only have to be farming, but have to be boots on the ground doing like sales calls and invoicing and all these different things with potentially 100 different customers.
So there's there's some good questions coming out. I think that we'll answer some more of these questions, but what I wanted to sort of point you to, we could go on and we'll continue to talk about stories and examples, but one of the things that, as Noah said, we've done is we've put together the local food distribution toolkit, which is a really good starting point, and it will keep you occupied for a good afternoon of learning and to come back to for resources. So that is available right now. You guys are the first that have access to it, and for us, it's also an iterative process. We kind of practice what we preach, and we put it out there, and we seek feedback on it. So some of the questions that you have, I think you'll be able to look at this, and we've also got a set of interactive tools on the site. So we've adapted Business Model Canvas and Customer Journey Map, which are really good tools to help you think through your opportunities and your challenges. And we've also created a budget template where you can plug in various values and test the financial model. So those are resources which are available today on the site, and we'd love to get your feedback and questions. So when you're there, please just shoot us a note and say, hey, this is great, but, or hey, I really have this question. And then I guess what we can do is really go to broader questions, starting with we can talk a little bit about consumer-driven models. We did talk about the farmer that we work with who's doing the buying clubs. And there's a lot of food sort of cooperative distribution ventures. But I will tell you, there's a lot going on with the direct-to-consumer market. But I think for the sake of this webinar, because there's so many different avenues we could cover, we have the most experience with folks that are looking at direct-to-restaurant and institution and to grocers, more of the wholesale market, and that comprises 60% of the total food market, both in terms of local and broadly in terms of the conventional food. So essentially, the market opportunity we see and the margins we see for farms and the sort of sustainability factor involved in wholesale is really strong. And so I think let's focus a little bit on that. I'm seeing a lot of questions coming in. Is there a % of revenue we can plan for the distribution model? Noah, you want to tackle that one?
Yeah, I mean, it's something that's going to depend on the types of services that you offer your farmers. You know, there are models like in the Upper Peninsula in Michigan where the transactions are centralized so that the invoicing isn't a burden on the farmers of a bunch of different customers, but they're still doing the deliveries directly to the customer, and that's a very different level of service than a place that, you know, the aggregator also is managing trucks and drivers. And so, you know, in the wholesale world, which is, you know, traditional distributors will have margins that vary by product, and that's another question of whether, you know, are you pegging the prices on your products to what the terminal markets in a region are? Are you like, how do you determine prices? All those things are, there's no one size fits all. But there are ways to project what your costs will look like and what a break-even percentage would look like. And so that's the budget tool tries to help with that kind of projections based on what type of model you're looking to implement.
Yeah. So it's really interesting. I think that the key is, and this is why we talk about going through, you know, sort of mapping out what are you going to do, what are your processes, because your processes will determine the cost structure, and your processes will determine what everybody needs to get to be sustainable. I will tell you this: there's no hard and fast rule, but about 5 years ago or 4 years ago, I did some research for the CS Mott group. They were looking at putting together case studies of grower-centric distribution models, and it was everything from, you know, producer co-ops to a specialty crop like an asparagus association to local food distributors to a co-op of blueberry growers. And the one thing that I will tell you that we saw is when you had a more cooperative grower-centric model, the growers ended up on average with about 75% of the final sales price of the product. And that's a little bit, again, that varies according to the services. But if you look at a kind of core model where there's some kind of hub where the growers are dropping off the product, and they maybe do some of the pre-packaging of the orders, and then there's an aggregator who brings those pre-packed orders into a single pallet or boxes, and then they do the delivery, that tends to be somewhere in that 25% range. And so, again, it's not hard and fast. I won't say that that's an absolute number, but it is something that I saw through doing interviews with about a dozen of these grower-centric it was specifically produce-centric markets. Were you going to say something? Okay. So, whoever has any analysis evaluation been done that assesses the differences between various models? That's a sticky question. I don't know of any specific evaluation. I mean, I have anecdotal thoughts about it, but...
Yeah, I mean, I think some of it's driven by, obviously nonprofit versus for-profit versus cooperative has different types of funding mechanisms and different ways of, if you do need to raise capital at some point down the road, governance. Those are issues that I think, will come up. But in the end, either any of those can be mechanisms to develop, local food distribution business, and it doesn't have to. That shouldn't be the first question that you think of necessarily. It's more I would say if you have food that is coming into an area and you want to, and some people who want to buy it, there's an opportunity to just kind of start something and then formalize it more as you need to.
And you also, what I would say is that we have seen some nonprofits, and Farm Fresh is a great example, but but most of the nonprofits are looking at getting to a point where the distribution side of their business, the aggregation side of their business does break even or become profitable, and so maybe there was some startup funding through grants, but there's more and more folks talking about separating their distribution piece from the nonprofit, and I think the question that I always ask is, if you can't make this a viable business, and it's food, and it is the most consistent, largest market on the planet, quite frankly, if we can't make local food sales and distribution viable economically from a mission-based perspective, whether or not that's for-profit, non-profit, L2, 3, 3C, whatever those are, then there's a problem with the business model, because people want this food. The demand outstrips the supply, and I think that conscious design and analysis of what you're spending your time on and what kind of resources you need is what needs to go into the planning of these ventures. There was another question about, you guys have any more questions? I think Jill is giving people instructions about the toolkit.
And I think when you sign up for the tools in the toolkit, the email that you'll get should come within the hour. I think it sometimes just it takes a second or two for the system to email it out. So the first email you'll get back is a confirmation, but then the link to the tool download might take it just a couple more minutes.
Yeah, not an hour, but a couple minutes to get through. It depends on your email.
I'll just jump in real quick and tell everyone that in the email that we're going to be sending as a follow-up to this webinar, we're going to have all the links to download the toolkit that Erica and Noah are speaking about with some of those instructions. So you can look in the chat window for some of that, but we'll be sending all that out too. You guys are doing a great job. You're making this moderator thing very easy because you're answering all the questions. I love it. Keep the questions coming. Keep the questions coming.
Yeah. So, I'm looking through these questions, and there's a lot. I like the kind of thread about romanticism, about urban or rural. And, there is a lot of romanticism, and romanticism in and of itself isn't a bad thing. You saw we put beautiful pictures in our presentations, and we want to make sure that farms actually look like the romantic version, but the business itself is not romantic. It's actually really hard work, and it's a logistics business. It's a supply chain management challenge. As much as there's the growing and the on-farm stuff, the biggest problems that we see that will help farms stay in business, that will help money stay in communities, is related to complex supply chain management with perishable products. And so these are really big questions, and it does kind of suck the romance out of it sometimes, but you've got to keep reminding yourself what the end game is. And I think that's also part of it. We go back to this, you've got to do things incrementally, you've got to have the big vision, but along the way, you have to be really proactive, you have to have small, manageable steps, you need to be able to test your assumptions with real customers, with real transactions, with real supply chains, and then make it better. And then again and again and again, and it's kind of repetitive. But then again, so is eating repetitive. So is growing food repetitive. So yeah, thanks Arno for your nice comments. Any other questions, guys?
I'll jump in. Actually, there was one question from Bob that I really liked, which I've also observed kind of coming up, and it's about job creation. His comment was, I'm interested in learning about new business models that are being developed as we build local food distribution systems. What kinds of jobs and entrepreneurs are we creating?
Well, there's a lot of different answers to that, and I don't know that there's one kind of job. Do you want to talk about jobs that you guys created?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of literally the distribution business, you have jobs in-house for people who are doing the sales, who are doing the driving of the food, receiving the food, managing the warehouse. You have people who are overseeing, obviously, the program, strategic development, business development. But then I think there's also all of the businesses that intersect. Like, we worked with people who, like the local box manufacturing company, and we're responsible. I mean, the amount of money we gave them in business, like, definitely helped them employ another person. And there are all those kinds of linkages where if a business, if a local food distribution company is choosing again to source other pieces of their business locally, there's money for a whole network of folks involved. There's obviously jobs on the farm involved in increasing production to meet new customer demand. And you wind up in places where there's new types of customers that are able to access the food, opportunities for people to start value-added production in incubator kitchens, or whole new types of products. Farmers can get engaged in starting new types of products. There's like it's the food sector intersecting with all of these other wonderful sectors and making economic magic happen.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that's what's so interesting, is that there is many different kinds of jobs as there are interests.
Right. You look at healthcare and tourism and hospitality, like there's just, food connects to so many different sectors, but is often undervalued.
Yeah. And actually, just going back to, I mean, it's really great to sort of lay everything out, but I will tell you from what I'm seeing with the folks that we work with the various markets that are working with local orbit, is that we see people immediately hiring delivery drivers, or having people who are doing, on the ground buyer and seller relationships. So they're relationship based. Sometimes the driver does the relationship building. So those are some of the things I've seen. And then what we've seen in the past is a farmer who has increased demand and has more sales will be able to hire farm workers. And I mean, I've seen a farmer, there were some orders over Christmas that never would have been able to be processed before when there were no farmers markets, and a farmer was able to bring in workers, unemployed seasonal workers, for a week. So even on that small level, there's interesting job opportunities. But the last thing I will say is we really focus on the quote-unquote entrepreneur, because I think what's exciting to me is how many people, every week I talk to a good dozen people who are starting or thinking about starting their own business, their own venture. And it might be a 1 or 2 person operation to begin with, but I think that there's a lot of freedom for people to kind of be an owner in these things. Let's see. There's a lot of good questions.
Yeah, well, there was a good question about where does food beyond the growing region that you're working in come into play. And I think, if you're talking about creating transparent, farmer-oriented supply chains where the people who are producing the food get a fair price for what they're selling the food, that's also a nascent part of what we're all trying to build. And if there's a way to get citrus from Florida up to Rhode Island, that's actually a supply chain that we help develop in the winter, because citrus, its season for grapefruits and oranges is the winter. And it was perfect for New England, where we don't have that much fresh fruit in the winter, and we were able to work with a farmer to get up, mass pallet shipments and be able to provide a price to the farmer that was able to keep that farm in Florida in business and able to make, a seasonal fruit available within the context of the supply chain in Rhode Island in a transparent way that felt great and tasted pretty good, because it was better quality citrus than you could get in the grocery store. So I think there are win-wins there. Obviously, the farther you get away from the production region in terms of where it's being sold, the harder it is to continue to have a transparent and fair supply chain built in. But there are people working on that all over, and that's important work.
I mean, I think the key is here that there's no, you can't be rigid. You wanna have people do the best they can and give them incentives, whether it's a price incentive, whether it's the sort of story that you can share with them about who produces the food and the quality of the food, that gets them purchasing as much local as possible, but we're never going to get 100% of what we want. I mean, I'm never going to not have lemons or citrus or avocados. The key is, over time, building more sustainable, transparent supply chains, as Noah said. It's not about, I mean, you want to get stuff that comes from as local or as close to you as possible, but as you start to drink coffee and eat citrus and olive oil, if you're not in a region that produces that, you're going to want to make sure that you have access to supply chains that are all being developed along this way. And, you know, a bigger vision, one of my big visions, is that you can have regionally marketplaces and aggregation models where, you know, there will be a lot of citrus or warmer weather crops, and then there'll be stone fruit up in Michigan. And over time, you can have those networks connect with each other, so you still have the relationship with the producer. It's just, you know, it's bottom line is we all are going to eat different kinds of things. So changing, there's a related question. Sorry, go on, Jill.
No, go right ahead.
There's so many, there's a plethora of questions. So changing consumer habits from demand-based consumption to supply, it's a good question.
And I think what's interesting about this work is, you know, it's a community effort in terms of changing consumer habits. Let's focus on that piece of it. But what we found with Farm Fresh was that by making it really easy for chefs to source locally, they were more easily able to make their menus reflect what was local and what was in supply, and to try out new things that, you know, in terms of fish, we had them putting like scup on the menu, which was not a fish that was very popular before and still might not be popular, but is in a really good sustainable supply situation in the New England fishery. And by having those chefs get to using it and putting it on their menus, then consumers were eating it and getting more comfortable with it and asking the chefs about, you know, how did you cook this? And all these conversations started happening where, you know, it just increased the knowledge in the community about how to even prepare some of the foods that were more sustainable and more plentiful in the region, where before there might not have even been that conversation happening. And so I think engaging chefs both as customers but also as educators is a really nice way that this work comes together.
I mean, what's interesting is I put this, I always throw this quote up just as a sort of talking point, but the chefs really are the educators, and it's what the chefs who are typically on the sort of cutting edge of food culture, what they tend to bring into the system is something that over time will flow into our everyday eating. You know, back to spaghetti, which nobody ate in this country in the 70s, until it became, you know, it was Julia Child and some other chefs that brought that stuff in. So what's really interesting, though, is that chefs also have pressure, and their customers want them to source local. So the National Restaurant Association says that 7 out of 10 people are more likely to patronize a restaurant that sources local. And I can tell you there are probably lots of restaurants that are saying they source local who aren't necessarily doing it in the way that we say is local. But if you can, you know, a big part is getting to restaurants. And I don't mean that in terms of just the sort of high-end restaurants, but the chefs are the folks who kind of set food culture. And because it's a competitive advantage for them, we're in a really great position to help change how people think about what you can do with what's in season. There was a question that I want to kind of go back to around value-added processing, and that's a big conversation, and I don't know that there's enough data yet to show whether value-added processing is the key to food hubs. I think there's a lot of speculation, but one of the things that the value-added processing addresses well is preserving the harvest so that the season extends, whether that's freezing berries or something similar to that.
Like when all the tomatoes are in season all at once, and every farmer wants to sell them, if you can turn them into canned tomatoes or tomato sauce that can then be sold year-round, you've essentially, you know, you've enabled a whole lot more by way of value coming to those farms than if they all had to go through the marketplace fresh at once.
Yeah.
But I think there's also an opportunity with the value-added processing piece to serve a whole new set of customers, particularly like schools and institutions that would not necessarily have the capacity in their kitchen right now, whether it's because of labor or equipment, to be able to handle butternut squash that's not peeled or broccoli that's not cut into a certain size. It sounds ridiculous, but that's a really big factor in whether schools are buying locally in many cases, because they don't have the kitchens anymore. They've been left to waste away, and then you wind up, if the local food economy doesn't have an asset there, like a business that is doing the processing in a way where they can get the carrots coined, then you'll never wind up with local carrots on the salad bar. They'll always be coming from the national carrot coining business. Silly things like that actually play out huge when you're talking about those larger customers.
Yeah. And honestly, it's a very important question to have. But in terms of, I'm kind of sometimes a little bit of a I'll play devil's advocate, and this is an emerging market, and we all have, there's many different priorities, and it's a huge priority to get healthy local food into schools, but to me it's maybe a bigger priority right now to keep farms alive. And I'm not sure that the first answer to keeping farms, especially smaller mid-sized farms, alive and sustainable is getting them into the public school system, because the economics don't work. So it doesn't mean that you can't eventually get there, but where you put your energy, if you're looking at starting a food hub or doing some kind of processing, where are you going to get fair value for everybody in the system in a way that allows us to build the number of farms, to build the market that will ultimately be able to filter down into solving the really big, hairy problems, like how do you get good food into public schools? And so I feel like one of the things that people do is, I've seen it, they try to solve that problem before they have the supply and before the producers have the economic viability to be able to get through that. And so I think there's some interesting value-added processing models that tend to be much smaller, particularly in the Northeast, which is doing a good job. But I also think that you want to be careful with the value-added processing and make sure you're not setting up something that is so expensive that it extracts the value and the price from the farmer in these situations.
I'm going to jump in real quick. I'm sorry. I know all these questions are so we could keep going on these questions for a long time, but I want to be mindful of only having 3 minutes left in our webinar here. So I think we're going to Erica, Noah, any final kind of closing comments before we start to close things out here?
There's so many. I would say that the key, my closing comment is kind of just to reiterate, and then I'll let Noah have the final one, is really, when you look at these big issues, figure out, if you're talking to an entrepreneur, if you are doing this, what's the first small step you can take to get moving? Because once you get moving, you can continue, but until you get moving, you're not going to be able to do anything.
Yeah, and I just think there's a huge amount of opportunity in this space when we're talking about 99% of the food system that is not working in a way that carries the values that we all hope for in our food and in our lives. That's 99% opportunity. So just to tag along from one of the questions that came up, we're hoping to build a network of alumni out of the hub camp and people who are using the toolkit continue to do the hub camps in new parts of the country. And I would say that if there is interest in hosting a hub camp workshop, a 3-day intensive around local food distribution in your corner of the country, we would love to talk to you about making it happen later this year.
Yeah, and actually the hub camps are becoming, partly by design, but even more than we anticipated, they're becoming opportunities for folks in a region to connect and to collaborate. So both of the hub camps that we've done and the third one that's coming up next week, we've already started to see people kind of look at how they can work together. And I think it's just the act of getting somebody in the room for 3 days to talk about how to solve some of these problems is, if you get 20 people in a room, a third of them are going to have something that they can collaborate with. And so it's been really, really positive. I don't think, Jill, we have time, although if we want to stay on, I know Arno has a question about oversaturation, which I'd be interested in discussing, but we probably want to look at winding this down, and then we can handle any other questions.
Yeah, I know there's a couple questions still on there. So Erica and Noah have graciously offered to stay over for a couple minutes, but what I want to go ahead and do is just make a couple closing comments, and then for anyone that wants to stay on and listen to that thread of questions and answers, we can stay on for a few more minutes. So just a really big thank you to you guys. This was a great webinar. Obviously a lot of energy and interest in the chat window around questions. So just 2 quick things to mention. I hope that you guys will be able to join us for Prosperity for All, which is the 12th annual BALLE conference happening in Oakland, California in June this year on the 11th through 13th. We're doing the conference really differently this year, and there's going to be a track that's focused on the new food economy. It's going to be a 3-hour kind of deep dive session that's going to be bringing all leaders from the food movement from all over North America to kind of revisit the food system through the lens, particularly through the lens of inclusion and justice, which is very much aligned with our theme, Prosperity for All. So if you haven't already checked out our conference, I hope you'll do that. You can save $100 with early bird rates if you register by May 12th. And then lastly, you can go even deeper into the localist movement by becoming a BALLE member and joining our learning community. BALLE is a community of leaders, and this learning community provides a lot of opportunities for you to connect really deeply with peers and allies from across the country and across the world, really, that are doing local economy work. So you can visit bealocalist.org to join for more information. So I hope we see all of you this June in Oakland. A couple closing reminders after the webinar. We're going to email everyone that registered a link to the audio and the presentation materials. Mikhail's going to be sending that to you guys in the next couple of days. We'll also have instructions on downloading the toolkit from Local Orbit, which launched today. I'm so excited that they were able to time their launch with this webinar. It was a nice thing to be able to offer all of the folks that had signed up. And then after this call, you guys are also going to receive an email with a link for a short survey about this webinar. We really do take your feedback seriously and use the results to improve our webinar. So please take just a moment to fill that out. And with that, I'm going to say goodbye to anyone who wants to hop off, and we'll stay on for a few more minutes and continue answering questions. And Erica, I'm glad you pulled out Arnaud's question. I was also very interested. He asked a question about, particularly in the Bay Area, there's talk of over-distribution. What happens when you have hubs, too many hubs in an area? Have you seen that before? And what's your experience like with that?
I haven't seen it before, and what's really interesting is that the hub camp we're about to do is bringing together a number of folks who do delivery and distribution in various forms in San Francisco and the Bay Area. We actually have started to work with more markets in Northern California, and I think that there are some really well-defined opportunities, but I don't believe that there's an oversaturation. I think there's a lot of fragmentation, and the fragmentation in that particular market it's not solving the aggregation problem. There's like a fragmentation of distribution opportunities, which means that everybody's trying to deal with multiple connections. And I think that there ultimately can't be over-distribution. I think that I will give a technology answer to this question. I think that ultimately the systems that people are using to source and procure and to transact, to buy from farms, they ultimately need to talk to each other, so you're not dealing with 7 different platforms or all these different disenfranchised businesses. You need to figure out a way to bring together collaborative trading networks so somebody can make a choice to work with one distributor or one hub or on one online platform, but yet still participate in the overall market. And I think as a market, we're a few years away from that, but that ultimately is, I think, what happens, which is the way you avoid over-distribution, because right now I don't think that the supply is enough that you can over-distribute. Maybe in California, but I don't think so. So I don't know if that's if you've got any follow-up, I don't know, on that, I'd be interested in yeah.
And there might be over competition for the same group of customers. Right. That can happen too, where if everyone wants to target the same high-end chefs, there's only so many customers that fit into that profile or in those networks. But, I would be surprised if there was that much higher than the rest of the country, actually, a percentage of food that's being consumed in San Francisco that is grown locally. So much of California agriculture, though bountiful, even in this drought-full time, is oriented around export. So there's a relatively small amount of it that actually stays within local communities in California.
Although, actually, this is a really interesting thing. The same Rabobank report that referenced the restaurants, they showed that they did a kind of assessment of local food market opportunities, and they did show that California, which is structured for export is actually seeing a decline in some sales when products are in season elsewhere. So if tomatoes are in season in the Northeast, people are buying them locally, and the tomatoes that are being produced and shipped from California are not selling as much. So in fact, the supply-demand ratio is a little bit different for California because of the scale of it. And so what Rabo actually, their report pointed out was that the California growers, and this is the large growers, really need to look at rebuilding the local infrastructure. So it's an interesting thing. So you can really directly see the impact over the last few years that the local food movement has had in proportion to how it affects California export business. There's a couple more questions.
Awesome.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if you guys answered, and maybe you did and I just didn't catch it. Aaron had a question earlier about creating a community of practice, kind of connecting all the hubs, which of course at BALLE we connect the connectors, so that's near and dear to our heart. Did you guys talk about that at all, or any sort of role that you guys have either seen or played in connecting some of the hubs from around the country?
Well, I mean, as Noah said, one of the things that we're finding that the hub camps are a part of that, and the coaching services that we're introducing. All of these training and capacity building initiatives are a result of what we see as huge demand, and the fact that the people that we work with are actually coming to us to find answers and to find resources. So one is we are introducing programming that will help create communities of practice, and specifically regional communities around the hub camps. And then, in general, I know, Jill, you were at the National Food Hub Conference last month, and we were all there, and they went from 150 or 120 participants 2 years ago to 400. So you do see a lot of people trying to figure this out, and I think we need more of it. I think one of the challenges, though, again, this goes back to how people idealize technology. There was a period of time when there were lots of online networks, like Ning networks, that people were setting up to connect local food folks, and they never went anywhere. So I think what we see is that it's not about online networks as much as really putting people in a space physically and regionally where they're doing business together now, as opposed to kind of broader discussions, or people, even if they're not doing business together, they're in the same business, and they can start to have practical conversations. And that's the way that we're looking at developing those networks of practice.
And then
I love that.
Karen, who was at the Hub Camp in Los Angeles, just put in a question about how small-scale food hubs and local food distribution options are going to be able to compete with the Cisco's of the world, and how those will evolve. And it's a question on a lot of people's minds. And again, it's a very emerging market, and so you see all sorts of different ways that it's happening in different places. And I mean, right now, there are actually cases where Cisco in different regions, to fulfill a local sourcing requirement in a contract that, they said in their contract that they could do local sourcing, they're actually working with certain food hubs to make that local sourcing happen, because they don't have the expertise or the connections really with agriculture in that local or regional level to make it happen without that partner on the ground. And so all sorts of weird, unexpected things happening in terms of those types of partnerships, and I think it will continue to evolve, where you'll see Cisco try to figure out where its local supply can come from. It's already doing that, I know, in the Midwest in a significant way. But you'll also, I think, see an increasing amount of sophistication coming from the emerging food hubs, some that have been around for a couple of years and are positioned to really supply fresher, higher quality product to customers, where now you might see a hospital break up a contract that they might have previously given completely to Cisco and go for the produce sourcing with the food hub. And that's happening in Philadelphia, I know, and there's a couple of other cases.
Yeah, there's a lot of cases, actually, and I mean, it takes some work, but I think that, it's easy to say how we're going to compete with Cisco and U.S. Foods, which is now Cisco U.S. Foods combined, and I think that the reality is there are 6,000 independent, often family-run local food, broad-landed restaurant distributors and smaller produce distributors who are competing. It's actually very difficult, but the reality is that Sysco and U.S. Foods together have about 49 or 50, no, maybe 51% of the total distribution market share. It changes a little bit. So you still have, let's say 48% of the distribution market is handled by smaller businesses, and those can be anything from like $5 to $30 million or $40 million a year distribution businesses. And those are the folks who are trying to figure out also how to provide local. So what I would say is, and again, this is something that we're seeing and we're working on with some of our markets, is when you look at your local community, when you look at your community and you look at your local resources, who's got assets? There are small distributors that have trucks and warehouses and food safety certifications and expertise with local regulations, who have space on those trucks, who have space in those warehouses, who have customers that are asking for farmers, but they don't have the expertise to do that. And so these sort of strategic partnerships can help the small distributors compete with Sysco, and that, to me, is a better question to ask. How can you work with the small distributors, the independent family-owned distributors in your community, to bring local to their customers, rather than how do we worry about Sysco? Because that kind of collaboration is going to save everybody money and grow the market for the little guys. So
I think I went through and got most of the questions that have come up, but are there any more that you wanted to answer that, or any other final questions? We still have close to 50 people that have stuck around for this extra part. So last chance for questions, guys.
Great. We'd love to do a hub camp in the Twin Cities and other regions. I'm looking at folks. We actually really are looking for partners that we think this framework for getting things done works, and there's ways that we can help bring people together. So I'm going to, shill for the hub camps. We'd love to do it. And what's nice is Noah and I do it, and we both bring some really good business experience and direct experience in the field, but we also bring in really experienced local experts. So we've had, and actually if you go to our hub camp page, you'll see the range of folks that we've brought in over the last 3 hub camps. And so there's a really good network of people that we're starting to put together, and we're also starting to now build a network of coaches. Somebody had asked the question, is this all tech coaching? It's not at all. There's no tech people. And I will say this is actually something regarding some of the tech stuff. Just for the record, nobody who's on the core founding team of Local Orbit and the core team has a tech background, myself included. I actually have a theater background. And we have really strong technologists, but our main community manager worked for 9 years at Whole Foods and was a specialty team leader and a beer buyer. Noah, founded and ran Farm Fresh Rhode Island. We have another community manager who has her own artisan food business in New York. And so we tend to bring in people who come from the space but also understand that technology is a part of creating efficiencies and facilitating better storytelling. And we look at technology really as a storytelling tool more than something that disconnects us from the process. So that's just kind of a broad perspective.
That's great.
You hit it all?
I think that we got all of the final questions. Yeah, I think we got it. Any other things that you want to mention, or shall we sign off for the afternoon?
Give us your feedback, by the way, on the toolkit. This is the first version of it, so we would love, since you guys are pretty engaged, we love feedback. So any thoughts you have to help us make a better resource, we welcome. There's lots of feedback forms on the site, so that would be my one request. And thank you, everybody, for really good questions. And we're very easy to reach and on our website, and then Jill will also include our contact information, I know, in the follow-up.
We'll do that, and we'll have some information on downloading all of the tools from the toolkit, and also there's been a request for the is it the Rabobank report that's to include a link to that as well.
Yeah, in fact, I think it was Michael Brownlee who pointed me to that report, quite frankly. I just saw who asked it. So, yeah. It's so funny but yes, we'll find that report. I swear to God, Michael, I thought it was you who pointed that out to me. And Justin, call us. We are Local Orbit headquarters. We are looking to bring on some folks. So send people our way. We're recruiting through our networks. And we would love to continue the dialogue. Thanks, everybody, for your feedback.
Thank you.
And I know we've got a handful of folks that have done our hub camps and the people who are working with Local Orbit in different ways, and it's really good. We appreciate your attendance as well. And we'll see you in Oakland in June, right?
We can't wait to see you guys at the BALLE conference. I hope that everyone on this call will be able to come and check it out. It's going to be a really unique conversation about building the new food economy. And Erica and hopefully Noah too. Are you going to be able to make it, Noah?
Yeah, that would be great. I hope so.
Awesome. Well, they will be very much involved in the conversation. So thank you guys again for such an incredible webinar and for staying on a few extra